Close your eyes and picture a medieval castle. Imagine grand stone halls, roaring fireplaces, elegant lords and ladies in flowing gowns, knights feasting at tables laden with exotic delicacies. Now smash that image. Medieval castles weren't romantic retreats, they were grim survival bunkers. From the outside, they screamed wealth and sophistication. Inside, they reeked of filth, cold, and death. If you think you're ready to see behind the stone walls, hit subscribe now and brace yourself. The medieval fantasy of castles couldn't be further from reality. Rooms were freezing drafts, whispered through every crevice, and stone floors sucked heat from your body like a medieval vampire. What might look like luxury to a passerby was actually a daily fight for warmth, comfort, and basic hygiene. The gap between perception and reality was vast, wider than a moat you couldn't swim across. Nobles had an odd relationship with cleanliness. Hot water was feared because medieval doctors claimed it opened pores to disease. Bathing was rare and often dangerous, leaving the wealthy to rely on frequent changes of linen undergarments to absorb sweat and oils. They layered heavy garments that might go months without washing. Even with clean linen, lice and fleas were omnipresent. These parasites weren't a mark of poverty. They were universal crawling companions of castle life. Nobles would casually pick lice from each other's hair during conversations, using special combs that were considered luxury items. Imagine etiquette intertwined with pest control. Fashion made hygiene worse. Multiple layers of wool and velvet trapped sweat, dead skin, and the scent of unwashed bodies. Perfume was the solution. Rose water, cloves, imported spices. Court records note nobles asking others to step back because their fragrance overwhelmed everyone. Picture lavender battling months of human musk. It was medieval Axe spray. Castle bathrooms or guard robes were primitive at best. Holes in the walls dropped waste straight down, often into cesspits or moats. No plumbing, no flushing gravity, and negligence ruled. Some guard robes were communal, multiple nobles side by side, chatting while disposing of human waste. Privacy was non-existent, and stench was catastrophic. Overflowing guard robes made entire sections uninhabitable. This created the notorious role of the gong farmer who risked life and health to clean cesspits. Toxic gases, disease exposure, and even drowning made it one of the deadliest medieval jobs. Despite their efforts, the underlying problem remained. Medieval waste management was essentially throw it outside and pray. Winter compounded the horrors. Waste froze, causing blockages. Thaw brought liquefied months of sewage into courtyards. Castle kitchens operated amid chaos. Massive stone hearths roared with fires. Cooks wielded cleavers. Smoke choked the air, and food preservation was a high-stakes gamble. Salt, smoke, honey. These were the tools to avoid starvation. When preservation failed, cooks had to improvise. Rotten edges trimmed, the rest boiled in heavily spiced stews. Bread could be adulterated with peas or sawdust. Rats were constant threats despite armies of cats deployed to hunt them. Kitchens filled with smoke caused chronic coughs among workers, but cold food meant hungry nobles, so the work continued. Disease spread like wildfire inside stone walls. Contaminated water, unwashed bodies, pests, castles were unintentional laboratories of biological warfare. Plagues, typhoid, cholera, tuberculosis thrived. Drinking water often came from stagnant pools or sewers, a roulette with death. Noble children faced astronomical mortality, half never reaching 5. Survival was a grim lottery. Servants endured an even harsher reality. Cramped quarters, often squeezed near kitchen stables or towers, offered little escape. Beds were straw pallets, changed maybe twice a year, teeming with fleas, lice, and bedbugs. They woke each morning itching, bruised, and exhausted, yet had to perform grueling labor without complaint. Food hierarchy in castles was brutal but pragmatic. Nobles dined on the choicest meats and breads, while servants survived on scraps, coarse bread, vegetable peelings, and leftover cuts. Not gourmet, but not inedible either. Lords needed their staff alive and functioning. Starvation was worse than moldy bread. Certain jobs were nightmarish. Laundresses handled freezing, often contaminated water. Gong farmers waded into cesspits. Kitchen staff inhaled smoke all day. Stable hands lived amidst manure, sometimes moldy, but paradoxically outdoor workers often fared better breathing fresh air and avoiding the suffocating indoor disease factories. Most servants did not live past 30. Mortality was driven not just by exhaustion but by respiratory diseases, infections, and accidents. Safety measures were primitive if they existed at all. Castles, though symbols of wealth, were death traps in disguise where every workday carried invisible risks. Winters amplified misery. Fireplaces romanticized in movies heated only localized areas, while stone walls drained warmth. Even sitting near a roaring hearth might not prevent frostbite. People layered garments, rarely removing them, while icy drafts whistled through holes meant for windows, shutters, or thin horn sheets. Windows were scarce, glass rarer still. Darkness enveloped rooms for months, while wind whistled through cracks. Cold seeped into bones. Bodies barely thawed from previous days' chill. Hygiene fell by the wayside as winter clothing fused with layers of grease skin and dirt, creating a personal cocoon of medieval grime. Overcrowding worsened, disease spread. People huddled together, sharing warmth and illnesses. Respiratory infections multiplied, mortality surged. Stored foods rotted in cellars despite freezing temperatures. Spring revealed horror-months-old meat, spoiled root vegetables decayed, bringing a grim realization that survival in a castle was a daily negotiation with fate. Despite all this, castles projected power and sophistication. Facades dazzled, towers impressed, and banners fluttered. The illusion was carefully maintained. From the outside, castles were symbols of authority and security. Inside, they were survival zones rife with filth, disease, and discomfort. Even kings and nobles with wealth beyond imagination lived under these brutal conditions. Cold drafts, contaminated water, primitive sanitation, and pervasive pests were daily companions. Comfort was relative. Luxury was limited to slightly larger rooms or fresher linens. The fantasy of regal ease was a mirage. Modern conveniences, light switches, hot water flush toilets make us oblivious to how medieval life truly functioned. One modern apartment bathroom outshines the grandest throne room of a castle. But the people of the Middle Ages were resourceful, building complex stone fortresses and sustaining a civilization despite conditions that would horrify us today. Medieval people weren't careless or lazy. They operated with the knowledge and tools they had. Ingenious solutions emerged for impossible problems. Wells, aqueducts, cisterns, and primitive plumbing systems attempted to manage water and waste even if imperfectly. Survival often depended on clever improvisation rather than comfort. Art, culture, and ceremony flourished within castle walls. Banquets displayed exotic foods, music filled great halls, and tapestries told stories of distant lands. These embellishments created the romantic image we cherish today. Yet behind every feast lay kitchens filled with smoke-contaminated food and persistent rodents, reminding us of the harsh reality. Noble children faced extreme vulnerability. Despite access to better food and protection, their mortality was astronomical. Half would not reach age 5, victims of diseases thriving in crowded, poorly ventilated chambers. Even wealth couldn't shield them from typhoid, cholera, or plague, making childhood a gamble with life itself. Medical knowledge was rudimentary. Prayer, bloodletting, herbal remedies, and superstition were standard responses to illness. Diseases like tuberculosis, dysentery, and respiratory infections ran rampant. The castle, intended as a fortress of safety, doubled as a petri dish for microbial warfare, turning daily life into a high-stakes battle against unseen enemies. Winter compounded hazards. People crowded together for warmth, sharing diseases that spread rapidly. Fires heated small areas, leaving the rest of the room freezing. Thick stone walls absorbed heat, creating ice-cold interiors, even in the presence of a blazing hearth. Layers of clothing were rarely removed, preserving a mixture of sweat, grime, and lice-infested fabrics. The first day warm enough for clothes washing was a major event celebrated quietly among those who could afford it. Sweat-stained garments fused to bodies, dirt accumulated in layers. Medieval hygiene rituals, already sparse, became nearly impossible during the long, harsh winters. Smells, pests, and discomfort became constants. Food storage was perilous. Root vegetables might survive, but meat and fish risked spoilage even frozen. Salting, smoking, pickling, and drying preserved supplies but weren't foolproof. The thawing of frozen waste or food brought unpleasant surprises, including the discovery of rotting meat that once seemed safe to consume. Castle kitchens were chaotic. Fires blazed dangerously, cooks worked amid smoke and grease wielding massive knives. Rats and other pests infiltrated supplies despite armies of cats. These kitchens were both essential and hazardous, where a simple meal required constant vigilance against contamination and injury. Noble hygiene was a performance as much as survival. Linen undergarments were changed frequently, absorbing sweat and oils, while outer garments went months without washing. Perfumes rose water, and imported spices masked odors. Even in court, nobles occasionally offended others with their natural scent, despite the luxurious attempts at masking it. Pests were universal. Lice and fleas were shared companions of all social classes, from kings to servants. Combing each other's hair became a casual social activity, and special combs were prized possessions. Clean linen offered limited respite. The struggle against insects was relentless, a constant background to medieval life. Medieval toilets or guard-robes were rudimentary at best. Holes cut into castle walls allowed waste to fall straight down, often into moats or pits. There was no flushing, no privacy, and multiple people might sit side by side while conducting casual conversations. The stench could overwhelm entire sections of a castle. Overflowing guard-robes created one of history's dirtiest jobs, the gong farmer. These workers cleaned cesspits and tunnels, facing toxic gases, disease, and the constant risk of drowning in human waste. Paid well but constantly at risk, they were essential to keep castles from becoming uninhabitable. Even with gong farmers, waste management was a basic crude affair. Walls became smeared with human excrement, courtyards were contaminated, and sanitation relied on hope more than science. Residents walked past piles of waste as if it were decorative stonework, normalizing conditions that would horrify modern sensibilities. Frozen winters worsened the situation. Waste would block guard-robe chutes back up into rooms and thaw in spring, flooding courtyards with months of accumulated sewage. Castle inhabitants had to endure the smell and navigate the mess as part of everyday life, blending survival with disgust. Kitchens attempted to balance preservation with safety. Meat, fish, and fruits were salted, smoked, pickled, or stored in honey. When spoilage occurred, cooks trimmed rotten portions and heavily spiced the rest. Decisions were pragmatic, rooted in survival, not culinary delight. Bread, a staple, was subject to fraud. Some bakers stretched flour with peas sawdust or other cheap additives. Honest bakers were rewarded with reputation. Dishonest ones could face public humiliation, showing a medieval form of accountability within daily life. Rats were relentless adversaries. No matter the precautions, rodents infiltrated food stores and kitchens. Cats were employed to hunt them, yet these pests spread disease, gnawed containers, and left a constant reminder of life's precariousness within the castle walls. Air quality was poor. Smoke from massive cooking fires filled kitchens, causing chronic respiratory problems. Heating was localized and ineffective. Thick stone walls absorbed heat and radiated cold, ensuring that every room was difficult to maintain at a comfortable temperature. Water contamination was common. Castle wells and moats sometimes became tainted by runoff or overflow from waste pits. Drinking water during sieges often meant choosing between dehydration and disease. Contaminated water was a silent killer, compounding the already harsh living conditions. Disease thrived in close quarters. Plague, typhoid, cholera, tuberculosis, and respiratory infections spread quickly. Even nobles shielded from physical labor suffered alongside servants. Mortality rates for children were particularly high, emphasizing that wealth could not guarantee survival in these concentrated disease environments. Servants' living conditions were far worse than nobles'. Cramped quarters near kitchens, stables, or workspaces meant they were constantly exposed to heat, smoke, animal waste, and poor ventilation. Escape was impossible and comfort was non-existent. Sleeping arrangements were minimal straw pallets that might be changed only twice a year. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, and other parasites thrived in these makeshift beds. Servants awoke covered in bites, itching, and exhausted before starting another grueling day. Food hierarchy was strict. Servants ate leftovers, coarse bread, vegetable scraps, and less desirable cuts of meat. While far from gourmet, this was sufficient to sustain them. Lords depended on their workers' survival to maintain daily castle functions. Certain jobs were particularly brutal. Laundresses worked in freezing, often contaminated water. Gong farmers cleaned the sewage systems. Kitchen staff breathed smoke all day while stable hands lived amidst animal waste. Each role carried its own hazards. Interestingly, some outdoor roles offered relative safety. Stable hands, despite the manure and filth, often had access to fresh air and sunlight, reducing their risk of respiratory diseases compared to indoor servants trapped in smoke-filled rooms or unventilated towers. Mortality rates for servants were catastrophic. Most did not live past 30, succumbing to a combination of respiratory illnesses, infections, and accidents. Safety measures were primitive, and occupational hazards were unavoidable in medieval castles. Winter intensified the hardships. Stone walls absorbed cold and fireplaces heated only localized areas. People would literally freeze in their beds despite roaring fires. Layered clothing offered minimal protection against frigid temperatures and drafts seeping through shutters or holes. Windows were simple holes covered with wooden shutters, oiled cloth or thin horn sheets for the wealthy. Glass was rare and expensive. Darkness and icy drafts dominated castle life for months, making daily routines difficult and increasing vulnerability to illness. By spring, accumulated winter grime created additional challenges. Clothing fused with sweat, dead skin, and filth. The first warm days that allowed for washing were celebrated, but disease transmission remained a constant threat as people gathered for warmth during the cold months. Food preservation was a gamble. Root vegetables lasted, but meat and fish could spoil even in freezing conditions. Spring thaws revealed the grim results of failed preservation, rotting supplies in cellars, a culinary hazard that could lead to illness or starvation if not handled properly. Castles were the ultimate medieval marketing scam. From the outside, they radiated power, wealth, and sophistication, but inside, even kings endured conditions that would shock any modern college student. Cold, drafty rooms, contaminated water, and constant health threats. The next time you flip a light switch, turn on hot water, or flush a toilet, remember, you live in comfort far beyond the reach of medieval monarchs. Your average modern apartment bathroom offers more luxury and hygiene than the grandest castle privy. Yet medieval people weren't lazy or ignorant. They used the best knowledge and technology available to them. Ingenious solutions emerged to survive harsh environments, from water storage techniques to early forms of food preservation and heating methods. Castle life did have genuine beauty and cultural richness. Noble halls displayed art, hosted music, and showcased craftsmanship. Yet all this splendor was layered over a daily reality of fleas, lice, freezing cold, and primitive sanitation that modern viewers would find shocking. Nobles were often forced into social coping strategies. Ritualized picking of lice became a normal pastime even during conversations. Perfumes and herb sachets attempted to mask natural body odors, but they only partially succeeded against months of accumulated human scent trapped in dense clothing. Medieval toilets, guard robes were a marvel of crude engineering. Waste dropped directly outside castle walls into moats or pits. Overflow and wind direction could render entire areas uninhabitable, while gong farmers risked life and limb to manage the filth. Castle kitchens were scenes of controlled chaos. Massive fires roasted meat, while cooks wielded heavy cleavers amid smoke and flying grease. Salting, smoking, pickling, and drying were essential survival skills to keep food edible for months. Even with preservation, culinary judgment was crucial. Spoiled edges of meat were trimmed heavily. Spiced stews, masked imperfections, and survival often depended on whether cooks could assess what was safe to eat, balancing resource management with health risks. Rats were constant adversaries, infesting grain stores, contaminating food, and evading hunting cats. Smoke-filled kitchens caused chronic respiratory problems among staff, yet the alternative cold, insufficient food was far worse, making daily life a balance of danger and necessity. Water supplies were perilously vulnerable. Wells could be contaminated by runoff or waste, especially during sieges. Drinking stagnant water was like playing Russian roulette with dysentery and disease, a deadly gamble that defined medieval castle survival. When plague swept through Europe, castles turned into death traps. Dense populations, poor sanitation, and pest infestations created ideal conditions for disease. Fleas carried plague, typhoid, cholera, tuberculosis, and respiratory infections flourished, killing indiscriminately. Noble children suffered enormously. Half of all children died before age 5, not from violence or accidents, but from diseases amplified by the very walls meant to protect them. Wealth could not shield them from the microscopic killers thriving in stone fortresses. Archaeological evidence shows nobles often had shorter lifespans than rural peasants. The concentrated disease factories of castles combined with stagnant water and contaminated food created environments more lethal than the countryside despite access to better resources. Servants endured the harshest conditions. Cramped quarters, straw mattresses infested with fleas, lice, and unknown parasites, and exposure to smoke and animal waste created near-constant suffering. Sleep was punctuated by bites and itching, yet work demanded relentless effort. Food hierarchy favored nobles, leaving servants with coarse-bred vegetable scraps and inferior meat cuts. While not gourmet, this was survival fare. Lords depended on their workers' health enough to ensure they stayed functional, a grim balance between cruelty and necessity. Specific jobs were particularly hellish. Laundresses worked with freezing, contaminated water. Gong farmers handled raw human waste. Kitchen staff inhaled smoke all day. Stable hands lived among animal excrement, often moldy. Ironically, outdoor work sometimes offered better survival odds. Fresh air and mobility in the stables shielded some workers from the rampant respiratory diseases and infections plaguing indoor staff. Most servants died before 30 not solely from labor, but from a combination of hazardous conditions, poor hygiene, and infectious disease. Winters amplified the misery. Fireplaces barely heated rooms, while thick stone walls sapped warmth. People froze near roaring fires, and layering clothing was mandatory. Windows were simple holes with shutters or thin horn sheets, keeping light and warmth minimal, prolonging discomfort. Overcrowding worsened disease spread. Huddling for warmth allowed infections to pass quickly from person to person. Mortality rates soared, food storage became perilous, and castle cellars could conceal months of spoiled winter provisions, creating constant survival threats. The romanticized vision of medieval castles, grand halls, shining armor, and festive banquets masks a harsh reality. Fleas, lice, freezing temperatures, contaminated water, and primitive sanitation defined daily life. Next time you order pizza or take a hot shower, remember you live better than medieval kings ever did.